Hello, my name is Pete Oliver Kruger, and I'm here today to please ask you to stop assessing people. I mean, it comes from a great place. We've got, great information that's coming from conferences that's talking about data, that's talking about collecting good information. So we've been collecting data. We have velocity, we have story counts, we have leading and lagging metrics, we have wait times and active times and year-over-year growths. And what's happened, though, is a result, we've reduced people to numbers. And we started pitting teams against each other, and they're battling it out inside of our workplaces and creating very unhealthy, non-psychologically safe environments. And so what I'd like to do today is instead introduce you to 5 tips that I've learned that can help you to reverse this, switch it up, do a different approach, and actually create a way of accomplishing the same goals, but to do it in a way that treats humans like humans. I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. So I am, it's called an Agile Governance Consultant. So in its simplest form, I run Agile Transformations for organizations. I work with the executives and all the way down into the teams to help figure out the right structure. Now, the reason it's put into the category of governance is because what we're trying to do is to create an environment, create the systems that allow people to grow without you having to be there as an executive, without you having to be on the floor on a daily basis, without having to micromanage in what's happening. How can you create a system that you can trust that'll hit the goals that you're trying to achieve, but do so in a way that unlocks the intrinsic motivation of folks? So how did we get here in the first place? Let me lay out some scenarios, see if it sounds similar to what you may be encountering. The patterns that I usually see are about a year or so into an Agile transformation. We have things up and running. We've got maybe some Agile coaches on the ground. We've done a bunch of Agile trainings. We've converted project managers over to Scrum Masters, and we've got product owners now, and we've built the backlogs, and we're running in sprints, and we're doing system demos, and we've got everything running. And then the executives come along and they ask us a very natural question of, how do we know that this Agile transformation is working, that it did what it was supposed to do? What is the return on our investment here? Because that's what they're dealing with. That's what they have to deal with. And so we go and we collect some information and we pull the data that we have inside of Agile. And so we pull story counts and we use that to show a picture of what we're producing. We look at burn down rates in order to show that we've gotten more efficient in how we're working on things and that we're able to get through our backlogs of work. We pull lead times to show that we can measure our predictability of when things are going to be able to get done. And we just keep adding more data on in order to be able to give this clear picture to the executives. But I had an experience once with an executive that really helped to crystallize for me what they're facing, and that is different than what we're actually doing when it comes to collecting the data. The thing that they're facing, and how he described it to me, is I've got budget cuts coming up. So we've been investing a lot of money into this Agile transformation, and Agile transformations can be very expensive. They're very good, very beneficial, and they set aside the money because they knew it was important. But now they need to know that it's paying off. They need to know that it's going to result in higher incomes, more outputs in what they're trying to accomplish, or that we're reducing the expenses. And we may not be reducing expenses. We may have expanded, we may have added in additional software to help us to be able to grow and run the metrics and do DevOps and cloud deployments and everything like this. And all of these things are cutting into the budget numbers. And so they're being pressed to be able to show some return benefit on this, or to be able to, as he said, I either need to accomplish the same with fewer resources, or I need to be able to bring in more money so that I can keep the people that I have. And that's a very real problem. It's not a problem that's solved by data. It's a problem that's solved by getting people together, united, pointing in the right direction, and being able to churn and deliver on those results. And so the solution to this actually isn't in the area of metrics. Metric is a tool that we can use to help us to get there, but it's more about the approach, and it's more about the psychology of how we pull all these components together that actually will make the difference between success or failure, and whether or not we achieve our goals and our targets, whether or not we get a great return on investment or we don't. All right, so what do we do instead? Tip number 1, choose your own adventure. Have you ever heard of those books from the 80s? They're called Choose Your Own Adventure books. You'd read a little bit about the story, they would set up the characters, and they would get into a situation, and then they would ask you down at the bottom of the chapter and say, do you want to follow this person into the next room? If so, go to page 56. Or would you like to turn around and exit the room to then go to page 87? And you would go flip to that section, and something would happen differently depending on what choice you made. Sometimes you died. Sometimes you discovered treasure. Sometimes you got even further deeper into the mystery. But it was fun because you were making that choice. You were the one that was deciding where to go next and driving that transformation. And that's the great way to tap into intrinsic motivation. So the problem is, every time that we have something coming from the outside, even though it's best and really well-intentioned, that direction from the outside to say, you need to look at this, you need to make this change, do this technique, add this thing, doesn't matter if it's coming from the scrum master or from the manager or from the tech lead, and that's part of the team. If it's not coming from the people, if the people aren't getting to pick and choose what to do, you're losing out on a lot of different opportunities. So Dan Pink described this really well in his book called Drive. And if you don't have time to read the book, which I totally would recommend, you can go get some videos online. Just go look for Dan Pink and Drive, and they'll give you the synopsis of it. And what he pulled together and the data and research that he collected shows that the people who are closest to the work are the ones who actually understand the problems the best. And that's what we need to understand, and that's what we need to solve. So that's the benefit that you get out of taking a choose your own adventure kind of approach. The teams actually understand what their problems are the best. And if you get them to identify and highlight those problems, then you're on the road towards creating the intrinsic motivation and getting them moved towards making the change and improving the system and creating better outcomes. Now, there's a difference between understanding your problems and understanding the solutions. Right now, we're just worried about the problems. Right now, we're just identifying what is the biggest problem that this team needs to solve, and then we'll talk about how to pull a solution in the next step. So how do you identify the biggest problems, or how do you find out? Sometimes it's just going to be right there. They're going to be emotional. They're going to be frustrated about a particular situation that they're dealing with. And that is going to be the best thing to capitalize on next. What are those biggest frustrations that you can tackle, that you can solve? If you need to go beyond that, there's a bunch of different resources out there that you can use as kind of a roadmap. There is the Scrum Guide. We just got version 2.0 of that. They can go through the Scrum Guide and take a look and say, oh, we really think we should do that. Or, this is really a problem that we're encountering, and this is supposed to be solved by this technique, so maybe we should take a look at this over here. If they're doing scaled agile, they can go to the SAFe graphic. They can go through and look at different things, go back and look at their training books, and make some highlights of what are the things that they think are the things that they need, and they're probably going to be right. There's a bunch of coaches that we've been working together on a collaborative community project. It's called the libraryofagile.org, and it's a collection of about 80 different potential problem spots that teams have. And folks can go through, there's some guidance in there and gives you some details. It really doesn't matter what you use as the source. What's important is that the teams are taking the time and the investment to go out and to do some research and understand and look at themselves and look at the problems that they have and do that work of choosing their own adventure. So give them a little bit of time. Maybe you have a retro day. Maybe it's part of another sprint planning activity, but give them some time to go through and figure these things out and figure out what their biggest problems are, and that will help to unlock things. All right, tip number 2, use an external system of record. The problem is when we start to compare teams against each other. It starts off with this idea of maybe introducing some gamification. It starts off with collecting some data and then realizing that one team has higher numbers than the other. And then we start comparing teams, and it becomes like, why can't you be more like your brother? Or why can't you be more like your sister? This team has 30 story points, per sprint, and that team has 40 story points per sprint. But how do we really know that 30 story points is not as good as 40 story points? We don't. And this comparison against each other is the source of a lot of the problems, and really one of the main ways that we get off track. So instead, it's better to do a comparison against some kind of external standard based upon practices that we could do, or ways that we could, changes that we make, and a checklist of different steps involved with that technique. Because the issue is that we don't really know what we don't know. I have a saying that I learned a while back, which is that if we knew the solutions to our own problems, they wouldn't be problems. That category of things that's often called like the unknown unknowns, the things that we don't know, are the things that trip us up all the time. And Agile actually has a solution for that. Agile really is that solution. It is that collection of stuff. Agile is a bunch of people who got together and realized that what they were doing was producing better outcomes than the people next to them, and they weren't quite sure why. And so they went in search of other people who were able to achieve the same success that they were, and compared practices. And then that led to the event at Snowbird when everybody got together and they wrote the Agile Manifesto, and they really looked at techniques, compared back and forth, and said, well, you do this technique, but I do this technique, and this one helps you, but it doesn't help me. Whereas this one is the same thing that you do, is the same thing that I do. And then they started swapping techniques, and they started looking at, if I did your technique in my team, did I get better? Did I have the same results? Then they started coaching other groups that weren't already achieving that, and sharing those techniques and making them better and improving them. And so what we have now in the field of Agile is a collection of techniques that have actually been time tested in a lot of different environments with a lot of different teams, and the ones that did the best survived, and the ones that didn't fell away. So when you get introduced to a new technique, when you get introduced to a new solution, that one is probably going to work without modifications. And what usually happens that leads us astray is we look at a new technique, we look at a new thing that we want to try, and we're like, oh, that's not going to work here. The way we do work here, we're going to have to add this, and we're going to have to put this in, and we're going to have to change that, and we'll take this thing out. And we customize the Agile technique to fit our old environment. But what we're doing when we're doing that is we're actually bringing our old problems along with us. The reason that we were working that way before, the reason we were having the problems, was those old techniques. So the best thing that you can do once your teams have done that choose your own adventure and figured out their best problem is to let them choose a new technique to try, but then encourage them to follow that technique step by step against this external standard. Don't let them customize it. Let them experience it and help them to understand how to do it in the way that it was intended and designed. And let that be their guide on whether or not they're doing it correctly. Because we really need to get to the point where we can confront our own biases and be able to leave some of those things behind. So, places that you can go to get collections of techniques. So again, we're compiling a bunch of stuff over at our libraryofagile.org project. Within our 80 points of problem areas within teams, each one of those things gets a list of guidance of like 3 to 5 techniques and tips of things that you can do. And so you can use that to then to pick a solution, a new way of doing things. And then we give you some examples of some stuff. Here's a technique from Kanban and one way that you can do this. Here's another place that comes from Scaled Agile. Here's another one that comes from Extreme Programming. They all solve this problem, and you just need to go and look through them and see which one you like the best, and let the teams choose which version of solution that they would most like to do. As long as it solves the problem, as long as it tackles the problem, It doesn't matter which version that they use. So let them, again, choose their own adventure and take their pick. What your responsibility is to make sure that they then follow the rules. Make sure that they then do it the way that Kanban intended, or do it in the way that XP intended. Because if they modify it too much, they're going to get too far away from this. So always use an external system of record. Tip number 3, self-assessments only. We're at the point now with the choose your own adventure and picking the solutions that we probably could use some data and start collecting data, but we need to be very careful. Now, there's nothing wrong with collecting data in and of itself. There's nothing bad about it. But how you use the data makes a difference. If the data gets used from the outside as a comparison, as a weapon, that's where we get into problems. And if we start comparing data between teams, what we're doing is we're taking another team's data and we're imposing it in on top of this team, and that's going to create problems. Instead, you want the teams to design their own metrics. They may not know how to do that yet. The first step, the first clue, is to help them to identify what's the goal, what's the outcome. What do we expect to happen after we make this change that you chose, the solution that you have? Is it going to help you to work faster? Is it going to help us to generate more income? Is it going to lower our expenses? Could it gather more information that we can use for later on down the line? Could it help us to reach more customers? Will it make your lives easier and happier? All of those are good reasons to do something. We just have to know what it is. And then once we have that, we can start to pair some metrics with those things. If the point is to work faster, then we want to pull some measurements and things like lead time. Are we spending a lot of time waiting for something? Is that going to reduce the amount of time to get things out the door? Or is it about the process time, that it's taking us a long time to do the work? And is there some way that we can shorten that process time? If it's about sales, we may need to talk to the sales staff and see what are those features that they can't sell the product unless this thing gets built. And so maybe that's the change that we want to make. And so we're going to make some architectural change that allows us to be able to deliver on these things that we've been promising for a while, and that will lead to more sales. Maybe we need to cut the budget, and what we need is the information about how much it costs. Sometimes we're using tools and we don't know how expensive they are. And we may think, oh, we absolutely need this, until we realize that it's like a 6-figure expense. And we're like, well, we don't need it that much. So give the teams the information that they need and let them design their own metrics, and you'll be surprised at what they'll be able to do. Tip number 4, track deltas, not absolute values. Let me explain what I mean by deltas just to make sure we're on the same page. I just mean the mathematical difference between the value after you run an experiment, after you make a change, minus the value from before you started making the change. In math, we represent that with the Greek letter delta, and it just represents the difference between the value before the experiment and the value after the experiment. So that's all we mean by delta. But the problem is that absolute numbers, values, don't really tell us anything. Like a velocity of 30 story points, is that good? Is that bad? We don't know. We can try to compare it, but there's no independent general system of record standard that says what a good story point velocity is. So what people tend to do, and they get tempted to do, is to compare it against another team and say, well, that team's doing 40. Is that better? It could just be that they gave them different values. So we can't compare between the different teams. All we can look at is say, this team right now is doing 30. They want to get better. They want to produce more output. They want to get faster. So we're going to run an experiment. They're going to do a change. And at the end of this, we're going to measure what their value, what their velocity is. And their velocity should be higher. They should get more done, or they should get a greater story count done within the same period of time. And then we just look at the difference between before the change and after the change and compare those two. That gives us good information. If we're trying to get faster, then lead time becomes a great metric. And we're not comparing lead times with other teams, we're comparing lead times within that same team. What is the lead time within that team before the change? What is the lead time with that team after the change? Subtract the difference, that's our delta, that's the improvement that we've had. Did we make a change and we went backwards? And it got longer, it got worse. We need to know that information. We need to be able to compare those two values, and that's where we're going to get our important information about this. And it could be that there is a finite limit to this. So for example, if we're trying to get to be predictable, we may hit a plateau. There may be a maximum to the number of story points that we can do, for example. Or we want to have a small variation. So from the number of stories that we can produce, or the number of story points that we can produce from sprint to sprint, maybe we don't want that to fluctuate very much. Maybe the difference right now is, from sprint 1 to sprint 2 is 20 story points, and 2 to 3 is a difference of 30 story points, and then 3 to 4 was 0 story points difference. And as we make some differences, we get more and more predictable, and that difference goes from 40 to 30 to 20 to 0, or maybe it sits within like a range of like 5. That's a great outcome. So it doesn't matter what that number is, or what the value of it is. The absolute number doesn't make a difference. The delta, the difference, the change. We used to be at a spread of a difference of 40 story points, and now we're at a difference of 5. That change over time is what is important. As you start collecting more of these things and designing more metrics and making more changes, if you want like that extra credit, you might start making a dashboard out of those things and track these things, because you never know if a change that you make a few steps down the road, a few sprints down the road, actually makes some of your previous numbers go worse. And that would be good to know. So if you can automate that, if you can collect this data and then make the next change and compare the two previous deltas that you collected, and then make your third change and see how many of those metrics it affects, and then make your fourth change and come back and see how many of those metrics changed, and you may be trying to make multiple metrics move in the direction that you want. All that is fantastic. But at the very least, just start with a beginning measure and an ending measure and calculate the difference in between. Tip number 5, our last tip, make it all about the learning. Teams are afraid of failing, especially if we're in an environment we were talking about in the beginning, where there may be budget cuts coming, or there is extra stress that people are going to be cut. They are constantly always put in a situation where they are told that failure is not an option. Failure is a problem. And that is actually the problem. Failure and success have very little to do with our outcomes and our ultimate success. The thing that causes the biggest problem is failing and then failing to learn from that failure. You also have a problem if you succeed, but you don't learn why you succeeded. You may not be able to repeat that success. The important thing, whether it's success or failure, is that you have learning and you've picked up some new information, and that you adapt that into your process and that you make a change. So you can go as far as celebrating failures. I've worked with a bunch of teams that get into this movement of like fail fast. And they have teams come in and talk about the failures that they had, and they celebrate those failures and they applaud those failures, and they have a great time for it. Just make sure that when you introduce that failure, you also ask them to talk about what they learned and what they are doing different. Great technique that you can use to help to promote learning, whether it be through success or failures, is communities of practice. Get a bunch of people together who do the same kind of jobs and have them share what they did differently. Have them share their changes. They should share the struggles and the problems that they had. Somebody else in that room may look at this and say, I think I understand what went on there, and have you tried this? Or we did that same kind of thing and we had this different outcome. I wonder if, if you did it this way, would it be better? Or if you did it that way, would it be better? Or some team may look at this and say, we were thinking of trying that technique, but seeing what happened to them, I don't know if that's going to work for us. I don't know if that's going to fit for us. And those different things are great. So celebrate anything, any learning, whether it be a win or a failure, and be able to share that, share the progress, show your work. Um, Show everything that you have to the other teams in a nice, safe environment. Maybe this is not a place for managers to be, just to create that extra psychological safety. That may be an option as well. But let the teams work with each other and let the teams grow and learn and work together. Give them that sort of external goal. Simon Sinek calls it the infinite game, that we're not competing against each other in some standards. What we're doing is we're competing together to get the organization further and to take us to another place. And the community of practice gives us a nice, hopefully safe environment to be able to share our outcomes and learn from each other. But again, the last thing on this is make sure that you're still using that external standard. So as you're bringing this in, have the teams compare these wins and losses and these proof of works and the examples, and have them refer back to those external standards and say, I noticed on the checklist that you did items 1, 2, and 3 out of the list, but you didn't do items 4 and 5. Maybe that's something that you want to add in for next time. Maybe that's going to give you the advantages that you need. Again, we don't want to compare against each other and pit the teams against each other. So use that external system of record as part of your communities of practice, and that's just going to help to better promote your learning. So those are the 5 tips and recommendations on how you can improve your process, make it more psychologically safe, stop using data as a weapon, and still achieve your outcomes and your goals. Start with a choose your own adventure. Compare it against an external system of record. Then you can start looking at collecting data, but make sure the teams design their own metrics, self-assessments only. Measure them not in absolute values, but in deltas, the change from before the new change to after you introduce the new technique. And then share that within the company and focus on the learning. Make it all about the learning. Put those 5 pieces together, and I think you're going to find that you can achieve the same goals and even better goals and better outcomes while also creating a psychologically safe environment. So give them a try. Let me know what you think. You can see on the slide here a LinkedIn address. You can follow me there. You can ask me any questions or send me any notes or updates as to how things are going, and good luck.